With everything currently happening right now in the college protests across the country, I thought it might be good to go back through some protests that people may have forgotten, because America has a long history of not just protests as a means to affect political change, but the comfortable in power using those protests as an excuse to further subjugate people advocating for their rights. So we're going to talk about everything from abolition, suffragette movement, civil rights, gay rights, segregation in schools, Vietnam protests, Iraq war protests, the labor movement. We have a lot of ground to cover. And the reason that I pulled from so many different sources to cover so many different topics is that a lot of these things, as we go through them, you will probably notice some commonalities. Mostly having to do with police violence, how it's used against peaceful protests, how it's used against non-peaceful protests, and what happens when people are finally sick of it. So as we go through all of these different protests, all of these different movements, many of which you've probably read about in high school or college classes, I'm willing to bet a lot of them you haven't. And unless you have gone out of your way to try and learn about these things, a lot of this stuff isn't generally like well accepted knowledge in just American society. But I think a lot of the things we're talking about today are going to be important to give context and framing to the protests we're seeing today. So I want to start with, all the way back in the 1800s, my man John Brown. For those of you who don't know, John Brown was a fervent abolitionist, and I have the Britannica article here for it. And probably one of the biggest examples of an American icon advocating for principles through violent opposition. John Brown is the pinnacle of direct action. A martyr to the anti-slavery cause, and was instrumental in heightening sectional animosities that led to the American Civil War. In the spring of 1858, Brown convened a meeting of black and white supporters in Clatham, Ontario, Canada, at which he announced his intention of establishing in the Maryland and Virginia mountains a stronghold for escaping slaves. He proposed, and the convention adopted, a provisional constitution for the people of the United States. He was elected commander-in-chief of this paper government, while gaining the moral and financial support of Gerrit Smith and several prominent Boston abolitionists. In addition to Smith, this group, later referred to as the Secret Six, comprised physician and educator Samuel Gridley Howe, teacher and later journalist Franklin Benjamin Sanborn, industrialist George Stearns, and ministers Thomas Wentworth Higginson and Theodore Parker. Some of them had provided financial support for Brown's efforts in Kansas, and they would back his next and most famous undertaking too. And this is what he is truly famous for. And mind you, this was before the Civil War had officially kicked off. Like this was in the swing of the abolition movement. But this was not when both sides were at each other's throats. Like this is somebody who did not sit by idly and wait. In the summer of 1859, with an armed band of 16 white and 5 black abolitionists, Brown set up a headquarters in a rented farmhouse in Maryland, across the Potomac from Harper's Ferry, the site of a federal armory. On the night of October 16th, he quickly took the armory and rounded up some 60 leading men of the area as hostages. Brown took this desperate action in the hope that escaped slaves would join his rebellion, forming an army of emancipation with which to liberate their fellow slaves. Throughout the next day and night, he and his men held out against the local militia, but on the following morning, he surrendered to a contingency of troops under the command of Robert E. Lee. He was tried for murder, slave insurrection, and treason against the state, and was convicted and hanged. Although Brown failed to spark a general slave revolt, the high moral tone of his defense helped to immortalize him and hasten the war that would bring emancipation. French novelist Victor Hugo wrote that Brown's hanging would, quote, open a latent fissure that will finally split the Union asunder. As they marched into battle during the Civil War, Union soldiers sang a song called John Brown's Body that would later provide the tune for the battle hymn of the Republic. So like I said, we're going to be jumping around through a bunch of different topics today. And one of the big undercurrents of protesting in America has always been the labor rights movement. And so I want to go through some of the biggest labor strikes in history, starting off with the Homestead Steel Strike in 1892. This is from History.com. Carnegie Steel's sprawling Homestead Steel Plant was the scene of a brutal battle between the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers and the company's chief executive, Henry Clay Frick, who wanted to break the union's power. In June 1892, Frick announced pay cuts for Homestead steelworkers and refused to negotiate with the union, instead locking workers out of the plant. Frick sent Pinkerton detectives on barges up the river in order to protect strike-breaking replacement workers he planned to hire. Pinkerton detectives had become known for infiltrating unions and breaking strikes nationwide, including at another Carnegie plant a few years earlier. When word spread of the Pinkertons' approach, thousands of striking workers and their families rushed to the river to keep them from coming ashore. The Pinkertons then became pinned down in a bloody gunfight with the strikers and were forced to surrender. Eventually, the state militia was sent in to suppress the strike and the union was crushed. But Frick nearly paid for the victory with his own life, surviving being shot and stabbed in an assassination attempt by anarchist Alexander Berkman. The Homestead strikers' resolve inspired other unionists, but also showed them how hard it would be to overcome big company that had government support. So people today don't really grasp how much of our rights as workers have been fought and bled for. Like, quite literally, people died for your worker protection rights. The reason that you have any rights at all as a workforce is because of violent and often armed resistance in the face of companies that at the time had explicit support of the government, much like companies still do today. This is from the AFL-CIO website talking about the same 1892 Homestead strike. Carnegie Steel Co. was making massive profits, a record $4.5 million just before the 1892 confrontation, which led Carnegie himself to exclaim, "Was there ever such a business?" But he and his chairman, Henry Frick, were furious workers, had a voice with the union. The company demanded wage cuts for 325 employees, even though the workers had already taken large pay cuts 3 years before. During the contract negotiations, management didn't make proposals to negotiate, it issued ultimatums to the union. The local newspaper pointed out that, quote, "it was not so much a question of disagreement as to wages, but a design upon labor organization." When Frick plotted to sneak in 300 Pinkerton agents on river barges before dawn on July 6, word spread across town as they were arriving, and thousands of workers and their families rushed to the river to help them out. Gunfire broke out between the men on the barge and the workers on land. In the mayhem that ensued, the Pinkertons surrendered and came ashore, where they were beaten and cursed by the angry workers. At the end of the 19th century, Homestead inspired a song well known around the country, "Father Was Killed by the Pinkerton Men." The lyrics of this deeply angry ballad began, "'Twas in Pennsylvania town not very long ago, men struck against reduction of their pay. Their millionaire employer with philanthropic show had closed the works till starved they would obey. They fought for home and right to live where they had toiled so long, but ere the sun had set, some were laid low." So already you'll notice between these two stories, the way that their, I guess you could say, legend has been passed down between both the strikers and John Brown. And those are important things to notice, because it's not going to be the proletariat and the business owners and the politicians who are keeping these ideas alive. The Pullman strike in 1894 was a widespread railroad strike and boycott that severely disrupted rail traffic in the Midwest of the United States in June-July 1894. The federal government's response to the unrest marked the first time that an injunction was used to break a strike. Amid the crisis, on June 28th, President Grover Cleveland and Congress created a national holiday, Labor Day, as a conciliatory gesture towards the American labor movement. When you hear people talking about how, peaceful protest, you shouldn't be interrupting people, when you hear dumbasses like Destiny saying, nobody should be stopped from going places. A peaceful protest shouldn't impede anybody's ability. That's infringing on the rights of others. I want you to consider that it really doesn't seem like any rights or any changes were ever gained by protesting in a way that was convenient. Because that just becomes tourism. That just becomes a spectacle. That becomes normalized. Would you believe it? It was started by a rich dude cutting the already low wages of its workers by around 25%, but did not introduce corresponding reductions in rents and other charges at Pullman, its company town near Chicago. As a result, many workers and their families faced starvation. When a delegation of workers tried to present their grievances about low wages, poor living conditions, and 16-hour workdays directly to the company's president, he refused to meet with them and ordered them fired. The delegation then voted to strike, and Pullman workers walked off the job on May 11, 1894. And I feel the need to remind you, this is 2 years after, and this kind of protest was incredibly commonplace. What we were just talking about before with the Pinkertons and gunfights, you were likely, you could get killed protesting. Like, this was life or death for people. That is the level of bravery that went behind your labor rights. That is why it is still so important when there are strikes to not be a strike breaker, to not be a scab, to side with labor. A brief timeline going over some, and we'll talk about a couple more of these, but this PBS document has a really good look at so many different labor strikes. December 4th, 1874, mine operators in Pennsylvania reduce wages and 10,000 miners go out on strike. The Molly Maguires, a group of mostly Irish miners, plan attacks and use violence against the operators and foremen. 20 of the Molly Maguires will be sentenced to death by hanging. 1877, Great Railroad Strike begins. Strike spreads to other states and state militias are mobilized, resulting in several bloody clashes. At least 10 workers die in Cumberland, Maryland. 1886. Day after a union action in support of an 8-hour workday results in several casualties. Labor leaders and strikers gather in Chicago to protest police brutality. A bomb is thrown at policemen trying to break up the rally, creating chaos that results in the deaths of 7 policemen and 4 workers. The clash is known as the Haymarket Affair. 1890, the Knights of Labor Trade Assembly number 135 and National Progressive Miners Union combine to create the United Mine Workers of America. The goal of the new union is to develop mine safety, to provide miners with collective bargaining power and decrease miners' dependence on the mine owners. 1892, steelworkers on strike. We just talked about that one. 1894, Pullman strike. We just talked about that one. 1897, 300 to 400 striking coal miners marched to demonstrate support of the United Mine Workers Association. Police, under the direction of Luzerne County Sheriff James F. Martin, ordered demonstrators to disperse. The march continues and police open fire, killing 19 miners. It is known as the Latimer Massacre. Another thing you're going to notice here is how, for the last 150 years, without fail, the police at every turn have utilized open violence. And this is not just in the 1800s. This continues all the way through. We're going to talk about other shit like Rodney King later. So when people act like, oh, well, police, they wouldn't use deadly force if it wasn't justified. That's not true. It is a part of the structure that they uphold, is using violence in defense of the state against people advocating for either themselves or for others. And now I want to talk about 1913s and the suffragette movement. Now, the suffragette movement over in Britain was a lot more militant than it was here. They engaged in fire bombings. They engaged in much heavier and violent militaristic rhetoric. Here, they tried to be more peaceful and largely were successful. 1917. After peacefully demonstrating in front of the White House, 33 women endured a night of brutal beatings. Dorothy Day was described by her fellow suffragettes as a frail girl, yet on the night of November 14, 1917, prison guards at the Occoquan workhouse did not hold back after she and 32 other women had been arrested several days earlier for picketing outside the White House. The 2 men handling her were twisting her arms above her head. Then suddenly they lifted her up and banged her down on the arm of an iron bench twice, recalled 73-year-old Mary Nolan, the oldest of the prisoners, in an account published by Doris Stevens. As members of the National Woman's Party, the women and their fellow silent sentinels had been peacefully demonstrating in the nation's capital for months, holding banners and placards calling on Woodrow Wilson to back a federal amendment that would give all U.S. women the right to vote. Now, these 33 women would endure the most harrowing night in the long history of the suffragette movement. By 1916, 9 U.S. states had given women the right to vote. Though he supported suffrage on a state level, President Wilson opposed the federal amendment, and Paul and the NWP decided to aim their protest directly at him. In January 1917, right before Wilson's second term began, women began gathering outside the White House every day, regardless of the weather. They wore distinctive purple, white, and gold sashes and held signs with slogans like, "Mr. President, how long must we wait for liberty?" At first, Wilson tolerated the women's protests, smiling at them as he passed and even inviting them in for coffee. But things began to change after the U.S. entered World War I, and the NWP chose to continue picketing the White House even as mainstream suffragette movement, led by NASA's Carrie Chapman Catt, threw its support behind the war effort. Amid the wartime furor, many people began viewing the Silent Sentinels as unforgivably unpatriotic. Onlookers sometimes attacked the women and ripped the signs from their hands, while Wilson himself wrote to his daughter in June that the suffragists seemed bent on making their cause as obnoxious as possible. Now, here's an important thing to keep in mind. It's true that you can care about 2 things at the same time. But you'll notice here is a great example of when a protest becomes inconvenient. The people in power seem to start getting more annoyed. When it's not just something that you can hand wave away and use as a convenient photo opportunity, you become an active thorn in their side. That same month, police began arresting the suffragists for obstructing traffic. At first, the women were released quickly and without penalty, but soon the courts began handing out prison time, but the women kept coming back. It's interesting to note they were arrested for obstructing traffic when obstructing traffic has been like a thing that the modern right seems to believe. Like, people like Matt Walsh have said, like, oh, this is like a new tactic. It's literally not. It's been around for over 100 years. Tensions were running much higher by August when the Sentinels rolled out a new banner accusing Kaiser Wilson of autocracy, followed by 3 days of attacks by an angry mob and police and the sentencing of 6 women to 60-day prison terms. When Paul, who had stayed off the picket line for much of that summer, returned in October, she was immediately arrested and given the longest sentence yet of 7 months. Faced with brutal treatment by guards and horrendous living conditions, including worm-ridden food and filthy water and bedding, Paul and others began demanding to be treated as political prisoners. After going on a hunger strike, Paul was repeatedly force-fed and transferred in early November to the district jail psychiatric ward. And this is 1900s, early 1900s psychiatric ward. Like, so the most hellish conditions imaginable.
Okay, so the scariest environment imaginable. Thanks. That's all you gotta say. Scariest environment imaginable.
Burns had her hands shackled to the top of a cell, forcing her to stand all night. The guards also threatened her with a straitjacket and a buckle gag. Day, the future founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, was slammed down on the arm of an iron bench twice. Dora Lewis lost consciousness after her head was smashed into an iron bed. Alice Kosu, seeing Lewis's assault, suffered a heart attack and didn't get medical attention until the following morning. These are the things that I want people to think about when you hear people say, like, you should only be peaceful. You shouldn't obstruct. Cops shouldn't have to get involved. It's more important, I feel, now than ever to learn about these things, which I didn't learn about this in school, and understand how hard people have fought for the simple things that we take for granted every day. The fact that women can vote. Things that obviously, as we've seen with Roe, measures on bodily autonomy can be reversed. Nothing is unfortunately set in stone. We do have people who openly think that women shouldn't be allowed to vote today. But everything we have is because people have suffered, bled, died, and did not back down from their convictions. There's a couple other things I wanted to bring up, not necessarily to show protests, but to show how structures of power will permit violence when they think it's acceptable. Namely, the police allowing violence because they agree with it, essentially. Or them at least staying out of it. We've already seen this on some of the campuses, where Zionists are allowed to launch fireworks and throw stones and assault people, and the police won't do anything. But the police will pepper spray and shoot, assault, bash students and teachers. I want to talk really quick about the Tulsa Race Massacre. This is from the Oklahoma Historical Society. The bloody 1921 outbreak in Tulsa has continued to haunt Oklahomans. During the course of 18 terrible hours on May 31st and June 1st, 1921, more than 1,000 homes and businesses were destroyed, while credible estimates of deaths ranged from 50 to 300. By the time the violence ended, the city had been placed under martial law. Thousands of Tulsans were being held under armed guard, and the state's second largest African-American community had been burned to the ground. 8 months later, an incident involving Dick Rowland, an African-American shoe shiner, and Sarah Page, a white elevator operator, would set the stage for tragedy. While it is still uncertain as to precisely what happened in the Drexel building on May 30th, 1921, the most common explanation is that Rowland stepped on Page's foot as he entered the elevator, causing her to scream. The next day, however, the Tulsa Tribune, the city's afternoon daily newspaper, reported that Rowland, who had been picked up by the police, had attempted to rape Page. Moreover, according to eyewitnesses, the Tribune also published a now lost editorial about the incident titled, quote, "To Lynch Negro Tonight." By early evening, there was once again lynch talk on the streets of Tulsa. Over the next 6 hours, Tulsa was plunged into chaos as angry whites, frustrated over the failed lynching, began to vent their rage at African Americans in general. Furious fighting erupted along the Frisco Railroad tracks, where black defenders were able to hold off members of the white mob. An unnamed African American man was murdered inside a downtown movie theater, while carloads of armed whites began making drive-by shootings in black residential neighborhoods. By midnight, fires had been set along the edge of the African American commercial district. In some of the city's all-night cafes, white began to organize for a dawn invasion of Greenwood. During the early hours of the conflict, local authorities did little to stem the growing crisis. Indeed, shortly after the outbreak of gunfire at the courthouse, Tulsa police officers deputized former members of the lynch mob and, according to an eyewitness, instructed them to get a gun and get a N-word. Local units of the National Guard were mobilized, but they spent most of the night protecting a white neighborhood from a feared but non-existent black counterattack. I don't even think Tulsa. What else do you need to say about Tulsa? The police allowed it to happen. They encouraged it to happen. One of the most brazen acts of racial violence in history. And what's more than that, it's important to remember, it was spurred on by the media. The media that everybody is always saying, oh, they're so leftist, they're so biased. The media largely is sensationalist. That's how they thrive. That's how they survive. And that is always important to remember, no matter what lens they're looking at something through, whether they're politically to the left or the right. And you've seen that a lot with these protests, where you have media, big papers publishing editorials likening students protesting the deaths of 40,000 people as being Hamas supporters. The same shit we've been seeing for months now. Fast forward a little bit to 1936, the sit-down strike that shook the auto industry. Over 136,000 General Motors workers participated in the strike in Flint, Michigan that became known as the strike heard around the world. Now, this is a super important one because this is one of the first examples of a sit-in. The same thing that you have seen people, again, like Matt Walsh. I love Elon. Thank you so much. I have to see his dumbass tweets all the time. Matt Walsh has been constantly talking about how, oh, these people are, they're trespassing. They're breaking the law. So obviously, they should all be rounded up and beaten and shot and everything else. Again, this kind of peaceful protest, almost 100 years old. The General Motors plant in Flint, Michigan was usually a thankless place filled with loud sounds and a feverish, dangerous work of turning metal into auto bodies. But in January 1937, the sounds of whistling and conversation filled the air. Instead of toiling over dangerous machinery, workers gambled, wrestled, and played ping pong on the usually busy factory floor. Quote, "We made a ball of it." Over 44 days in 1936 and 1937, members of the fledgling United Auto Workers Union managed to bring an auto behemoth to its knees in a sit-down strike that became one of the most decisive victories in American labor history. Exhausted by the industry's dangerous demands and sharpened by the Great Depression, over 100,000 auto workers changed labor history without picketing their plant. Instead of walking out, they simply sat down and refused to leave. Historically, striking workers had risked their lives on the picket lines. We've talked about this before. Though unions often formed in response to dangerous working conditions, going on strike exposed workers to the danger of physical violence from hired thugs or police that served as companies' strong arms. Unions had long struggled to create unions across industries. Instead, craft unions that organized workers across specialties were the norm. But then the Great Depression hit in 1929. Car sales collapsed and the industry's production levels sagged. Automakers slashed jobs, axing thousands of employees with no regard for seniority. Those who did keep their jobs tolerated abysmal working conditions, afraid to speak up, lest they be laid off too. The story was the same across the entire economy and stoked discontent among job seekers and workers alike. Meanwhile, the nation's largest automakers, General Motors, was actually experiencing an uptick in sales thanks to its aggressive response to the Great Depression. When the economy had begun to spin out of control, GM had slashed prices, cut production of some expensive models, and laid off huge swaths of its workforce. This move helped keep GM on top. 13 days after the strike began, GM cut off heat in 16-degree weather. When workers went outside to complain, security guards and police rushed in. As tear gas filled the plant, workers fought back, throwing everything from automobile bolts to pieces of roof on the attackers before the police finally fled. Workers dubbed the melee the Battle of the Running Bulls. In response, Michigan Governor Frank Murphy mobilized the National Guard. Quote, "Law and order must be maintained in Michigan." In the past, news of 1,200 guardsmen descended on Flint to impose law and order would have been devastating to workers who knew they would be used as a weapon against them. But Murphy was labor-friendly and didn't use troops to intimidate workers. Instead, the National Guard became a peacekeeping force that ultimately protected the workers and facilitated negotiations. In an ideal world, that's what all policing and military would actually do, but that's not how they're actually used. Also, would like to note another time where a different time for America where police didn't just resort to murdering and on first sight, and they were not just militarized, obviously, but another time where fighting back against the police, not only morally justified, but they were completely proven right by history. Though much of the public was against sit-down strikes and considered labor unionists to be dangerous rabble-rousers, GM's public image had suffered too, and labor would never be the same. Union membership ballooned from 3.4 million workers in 1930 to 10 million in 1942, and the majority of the automobile industry swiftly unionized, gaining benefits and pay they never would have obtained without organizing. The year after, I want to talk about the 1937 Memorial Day Massacre, because this is another example of, and stop me if you're starting to notice a trend here, Chicago police attacked a Memorial Day gathering of unarmed striking steelworkers and their families. The police shot and killed 10 of the strikers. While we're on the subject of how structures of power are used to suppress dissent and just people in general to protect the interests of those in power, I want to take a brief break to learn about something I wish I would have learned in high school. The United Fruit Company, and how the CIA helped basically suppress any kind of labor or communist or populist sentiment in South America for decades, including teaching some of the most reprehensible and violent regimes you'd ever find how to torture people. We did that. So I want to talk really quick about the United Fruit Company and the School of the Americas really quick. On March 10th, 2014, this is from Washington State University's website, Chiquita Brands International announced it was merging with the Irish fruit company Fifes. After the merger, Chiquita Fifes would control over 29% of the banana market, more than any one company in the world. However, this is not the first time in history these companies have been under the same name. Chiquita Brands and Fifes were both owned by the United Fruit Company until 1986. This modern merger marks the reunion and continued takeover of the banana market. United Fruit Company was known for its cruelty in the workplace and the racist social order they perpetuated. First initiated its advertising in 1917. By this time, the company had well-established plantations in various countries in Central and South America. All they needed now was to interest the American people in trying new, exotic things in order to sell the bananas they were producing. At this time in American history, it was through advertisements, thought advertisements should target customers' rationale, not their emotions. So United Fruit hired scientists to author positive reviews about bananas, whether they were true or not. A politician named Jacobo Arbenz was elected president in Guatemala, one of the Central American countries occupied by United Fruit. Arbenz was a strict nationalist, and all he wanted was for his people to stop suffering and poverty. One of the most prominent issues in Guatemala at the time was scarcity of land. When United Fruit invaded Guatemala, they brought out many of the local farmers to acquire land for their plantations. This did not leave room for the peasants who relied on farming as the sole source of their income. Arbenz created an agrarian reform that took land from the company and gave it back to the poor farmers that needed it. United Fruit was outraged by his reform. They immediately launched a propaganda campaign led by Edward Bernays to convince the United States government and its people that Arbenz was a communist dictator. In a 1953 article by the New York Times, Guatemala was described as operating under increasingly severe communist-inspired pressure to rid the country of United States companies. United Fruit was manipulating the media to make it sound like an agrarian reform was only created because Arbenz was being influenced by the Soviet government to sabotage America's economic imperialism in Central America. So, again, we are seeing the media being used to push information from massive corporations, which kind of feels like the massive corporations manipulating things kind of feels only slightly prescient when you consider Boeing just like very obviously off the second whistleblower. Like, Boeing's really pushing their luck in a real Epstein kind of way. You're getting too much heat on you. Since it was during the Cold War, association with communists was a serious accusation. The United States' aggressive stance towards communism encouraged them to take immediate action. The CIA hired civilian militias from Honduras to come into Guatemala and start a war against Arbenz and his followers. United Fruit also convened U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower to threaten Arbenz because Eisenhower and many other prominent American government officials had stock in United Fruits. Shocker. With these pressures, Arbenz feared for his life and submitted his resignation. However, this did not satisfy United Fruit. They wished to make an example of Guatemala so other host nations wouldn't dare oppose them. They had the CIA pay off the Guatemalan military so they would let the Honduras militia win. After the victory, the leader of the Honduran militia, Castillo Armas, was appointed as president of Guatemala, and Armas was a puppet of United Fruit Company for the rest of his term. He returned all of the confiscated land and gave them preferential treatment in all Guatemalan ports and railways. Sorry, the text is like really small for me. The company continued to influence the media of North and Central America to justify what they had done. They called Armas the Liberator and told the inspiring tale of how he freed Guatemala from its communist ties. They also destroyed what was left of Arbez's reputation by calling him Red Jacobo, further tying him to the Soviets. A New York Times article written in 1954 states that, quote, President Castillo Armas is continuing to act with moderation and common sense, and Jacobo Arbenz, anyway, is a deflated balloon, hardly likely to cause any more trouble. The United States School of Torture in Latin America. This is from Uterish.com. The School of the Americas was founded as a United States military base in Panama in 1946 in order to supplement traditional military training for the United States Army. Though there is an imperialist tinge to any foreign military presence in a politically insecure nation, the original mission of the School of the Americas was focused inward rather than outwards. However, by the 60s, the School of the Americas was not just a military base, it was a hotbed for nascent dictators, teaching young military hopefuls from Latin America to torture and coerce their way to power. Eventually, it became known as La Escuela de los Golpes, or the School of the Coups. For the sheer number of authoritarian dictators it graduated, but what business did the United States have implementing dictatorships anywhere, and why Latin America? Here's the simplest way to put it. The United States wants to protect its dominance in the global sphere, and protecting capitalism was a way to do that. After World War II, the Soviet Union had risen as a competing global power. There was competition with huge stakes for the US, who understood capitalism and communism to be fundamentally incompatible economic systems. The mere presence of communism in the Soviet Union suggested to the US that there was a valid threat of communism anywhere, everywhere. The anxiety crested to such a height that the United States lost sight of any actual source of the threat, communism in the Soviet Union, as they perceived it, instead blurring legitimate and fabricated concerns for the security of economic preeminence such that they became imperceptible. The United States not only believed in the threat of communism, they believed it to be coming from Latin America. Jacobo Arbenz, ex-military president Guatemala elected in 1950, represented one of the Latin American leaders who led an agrarian reform and was promptly and brutally punished for it by the United States. Arbenz was a definite capitalist who by all measures posed no threat to the sovereignty of the US. In 1952, he wrote a reform into law that would take uncultivated land from the largest landowners and deed them to smaller family members. The idea was that it would not infringe upon the rights of a big farmer to thrive while taking the unused land as an opportunity for smaller farmers to survive. Unfortunately, Guatemala's largest proprietor at the time was the United Fruit Company. The UFCO was interested only in profit after exploiting Latin America's and knowingly at the expense of the livelihoods of the country it grew fruit in. As such, it did not take kindly to this reform. The United States officially backed the overthrow of the Arbenz government in favor of a strong string of brutal dictatorships. The success of Castro and popularity of land reforms like Arbenz fed into a deep paranoia in the U.S., a paranoia which was then mechanized through the School of the Americas. The School of the Americas was the official attempt to quell any hint of populism. It taught torture, civilian disappearance, and coercion alongside military tactics, and graduated dictators and terrorists that went on to suppress nearly every Latin American country. Some of the most horrible men in history graduated from the School of the Americas, such as Chile's Manuel Contreras, the head of Pinochet's secret police, or El Salvador's death squad leader, Roberto Arrieta. Populism was effectively repressed, and the capitalist regime flourished at the direct expense of the health, safety, and well-being of the entire continent. When people say shit is made in South America, product of Peru, product of Brazil, this is how we've been getting that shit in this country for so long. I want to talk more about civil disobedience. I want to talk more about technically trespassing and doing something illegal and being inconvenienced. And how, man, kind of like the auto union strike, some of the people who did that shit end up on the right side of history. And all the people pearl clutching over, oh my gosh, they're sitting in, they're trespassing, they're disrupting things, should get in the bin. The Woolworth sit-in that launched a movement. On February 1st, 1960, 4 students from an all-black North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College walked into a Woolworth Five and Dime with the intention of ordering lunch. But the manager of the Greensboro Woolworth, God, that is so hard to say. But the manager of the Greensboro Woolworth had intentions of his own to maintain the lunch counter's strict whites-only policy. Franklin McCain was one of 4 young men who shoved history forward by refusing to budge. McCain remembers the anxiety he felt when he went to the store that Monday afternoon, the plan he and his friends had devised to launch their protest, and how he felt when he sat down on that stool. 15 seconds after, I had the most wonderful feeling. I had the feeling of liberation, restored manhood. I had a natural high, and I truly felt almost invincible. Mind you, I was just sitting on a dumb stool and not having asked for service yet. It's a feeling that I don't think I'll ever be able to have again. It's the kind of thing that people pray for, and I wish for all their lives and never experience it. And I felt as though I wouldn't have been cheated out of life had that been the end of my life at that second or moment. On that first day, February 1st, the 4 men stayed at the lunch counter until closing. The next day, they came back with 15 other students. By the third day, 300 joined in. Later, 1,000. The sit-in spread to lunch counters across the country and changed history. Now I want to go one year forward, talking more about civil rights stuff for a little bit. For the Freedom Riders. During the spring of 1961, student activists from the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, launched the Freedom Rides to challenge segregation on interstate buses and bus terminals. Traveling on buses from D.C. to Jackson, Mississippi, the riders met violent opposition in the Deep South, garnering extensive media attention and eventually forcing federal intervention from JFK's administration. On the 4th of May, 1961, the Freedom Riders left D.C. in 2 buses and headed to New Orleans. They faced resistance and arrest in Virginia. It was not until the riders arrived in Rock Hill, South Carolina, that they encountered violence. The beating of John Lewis, and another rider, coupled with the arrest of one participant for using a whites-only restroom, attracted widespread media coverage. In the days following the incident, the riders met King and other civil rights leaders in Atlanta for dinner. During this meeting, King whispered prophetically to Jet reporter Simeon Booker, who was covering the story, "You will never make it through Alabama." The ride continued to Anniston, Alabama, where on the 14th of May, riders were met with a violent mob of over 100 people. Before the bus's arrival, Anniston local authorities had given permission to the Ku Klux Klan to strike against the Freedom Riders without fear of arrest. As the first bus pulled up, the driver yelled outside, "Well, boys, here they are. I brought you some N-words and N-word lovers." One of the first buses was firebombed, and its fleeing passengers were forced into the angry white mob. The violence continued at the Birmingham terminal, where Eugene Bull Connor's police force offered no protection. Although the violence garnered national media attention, the series of attacks prompted James Farmer of CORE to end the campaign. The riders flew to New Orleans, bringing to an end the first freedom rides of the 1960s. Let's talk about the 1961 Black Night incident. An interview with Josie Carter in 2011 revealed just one of Josie's most colorful adventures, which was to become a landmark event in Milwaukee LGBT history. As the greatest generation continues to leave us, the actual course of these events has slowly evaporated into hidden history. As a result, many people today believe that LGBTQ history began with New York's Stonewall riots of 1969. But 8 years before Stonewall, Milwaukee was the scene of an early uprising unlike anything local police had ever seen before. On Saturday night, August 5th, 1961, 4 troublemakers got more trouble than they bargained for at the Black Night, one of Milwaukee's most popular gay bars at the time. It wasn't just a tavern that tolerated homosexuals, it was, from the start, a tavern that embraced and welcomed them. Wetham, a twice-married man with children, became well known for creating a safe and generous space for his customers. All sexual and gender expressions were welcome, something extremely rare to find in mid-century Milwaukee, and customers were fiercely protective of their turf. The fierceness made itself known on Saturday, August 5th, 1961. After partying at a Kane Place Tavern, 4 20-something servicemen decided to check out the Black Night on a dare. Despite being asked several times, they refused to show any identification to the bouncer and wound up being forcibly removed. One of the servicemen would later claim he was grabbed, punched, and hit on the head with a bottle for no reason, but that's not exactly what happened. The servicemen fled the bar, took their injured friend to County Emergency Hospital, and went back to the Kane Place Tavern. They rounded up a dozen men and decided to go back downtown and clean up the Black Night. According to Josie, after the men left, Wally said, "Okay, you guys have got to get out of here because God knows what is about to happen. But we did not run from a fight. We did not run from nothing," said Josie. And wouldn't you know it, those pig-ass mothers came back and just tore apart the bar looking for little old me and my husband because their buddy got beat up. Wally later reported this game came in and started tearing the bar apart, and the bar fought back. Earlier that night, the servicemen had found a nearly empty bar and a 4-to-1 fight against the bouncer. This time, they found a packed bar of 75 patrons ready and willing to defend their turf by any means necessary. The battle didn't last long, but it was intense. One patron suffered extreme lacerations when he was thrown through a broken window. Another patron experienced a brain concussion when he was hit in the head with a bar stool. He would remain in critical condition for weeks after the brawl. In the end, over $2,000 in losses were reported. With that little bit out of the way, I want to talk about the Black Panthers and Fred Hampton, because this whole situation is a great example of how the U.S. really, and police really don't like anybody who might actually get some good wind under their wings, who might actually be leading any kind of real populist movement. The lasting legacy of 1967 Black Panther gun control protests at California Capitol. 57th anniversary of one of the most spectacular protests in California state history. The Black Panthers entered the Capitol building armed with guns in protest. Entering the Capitol building with an open carry gun was not against the law then. That changed quickly. Video from that day shows the scene. Black Panthers in their trademark berets and leather jackets carried handguns and shotguns through the halls of the Capitol. State police only stopped the men after 10 had reached the assembly chambers. The shocking protest was aimed at a state gun control legislation seeking to prevent the Black Panthers' police patrols, their practice of following officers in black neighborhoods. Black Panther Bobby Seale spoke about the mission then. We don't hate nobody because of their color, we hate oppression. Bill X. Jennings is a Black Panther alumni who is now an activist in the Black Panther movement. He showed his collection, including a photo of him walking into a courthouse with Black Panther founder Huey Newton. Yeah, no, it wasn't Emily Nelson. It wasn't so much that, as it notes here, it wasn't so much that like Reagan was gun control obsessive. It was that like, oh no, the black people have guns. We need to make sure that it's a crime in a way that we can. Like in a way that's not too explicitly racist. Like white people can get in trouble for this too, but we need to make what they did specifically a crime. At some point in 1969, Chicago police and FBI managed to place a spy, William O'Neill, within the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party. During the night of December 3rd, it is widely believed that he drugged Fred Hampton to ensure that he would not be able to defend himself. Early the next morning, the police descended on 2337 West Monroe Street in Chicago's West Side. Police entered the residence and shot Mark Clark, who was on guard, once in the chest. Either his death spasm or his falling to the floor caused him to fire his gun upward, the only shot the Black Panthers fired during this raid and done posthumously. The police, who were heavily armed, including with a submachine gun, opened fire throughout the apartment despite pleas to stop, firing at least 90 bullets. When the onslaught ceased, Fred Hampton and Deborah Johnson were miraculously only injured. The police entered the bedroom and removed Johnson, who had been attempting to shield Hampton with her pregnant body, and dragged her into another room. She then heard the police execute her fiancé. Here's another interesting thing just to note, as police love to do. In hindsight, they'll kind of change their story or they'll present it one way, and then it'll come out that later that's totally bullshit. A super important thing to keep in mind as you're looking at the modern college protests and how the police narratives are kind of just being willy-nilly perpetuated and shared by media all over the place. Immediately after the event, the authorities, led by State's Attorney Edward Hanrahan, and the police claimed many things, namely that the assassination had been a shootout, that Fred Hampton himself had fired on them, and that he had been killed by the bullets the police had sprayed across the room. These statements would all prove to be false. The Black Panthers countered this narrative by opening the rooms to the public and letting journalists examine them, exposing and driving home the level of violence that was used against them. This led to the discovery, published by the Chicago Tribune, that the bullet holes supposedly caused by the Black Panthers' bullets were in fact from nails used to post materials to the door, thus causing a furor. This was essential and proved many a Black Panther's innocence. The media continued to publish both sides of the story, though the Chicago Tribune, The media continued to publish both sides of the story, though the Chicago Tribune to some extent and the Chicago Defender to a much greater extent supported the Black Panthers. The police were acting under the orders of Edward Hanrahan, the Cook County State's Attorney, who held a press conference claiming that his officers were surprise attacked by the Black Panthers as the police tried to execute a search warrant for illegal weapons in the apartment. While it didn't take long for Hanrahan's account to fall apart, it took more than a decade for the whole disturbing truth to come to light. Not only was the killing of Hampton and Clark a cold-blooded assassination, but documents later revealed it was coordinated by the FBI as part of a secret program to neutralize and destroy the Black Panther Party, which FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover privately called, quote, the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. And here's again, a youth-led movement right here. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was formed in 1966 by a pair of black college students in Oakland. With their military-style berets and raised fist salute, the Black Panthers preached black empowerment and armed resistance to racist violence, including at the hands of police. The Black Panther Party also started a wealth of social initiatives, including a free breakfast program that helped feed thousands of hungry kids before school. So here we have, and they not only that, but they had their own neighborhood watch. As noted, they would go and follow around police officers on patrol to make sure they didn't do anything wrong. You have right here what so many people, so many racists say, like, well, why don't you just stick to your own kind? Why don't you stick to your own people? And that's what the Black Panthers did. They essentially did their best, much like Black Wall Street. They did their best to set up social initiatives, social safety nets for their own community. And that, to the United States government, to the police, to the people in power, that was dangerous. Chicago at the time was a hotbed of political protests and violent clashes with the police. When crowds took to the streets after the 1968 assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., the Chicago mayor ordered police to shoot suspected arsonists. Later that year, police and National Guard troops pummeled anti-war protesters outside the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. While we're talking about civil rights and the struggles of the 60s, I want to talk this fun little article, Protests Seen as Harming Civil Rights Movements in the 1960s. Because so many centrist milquetoast libs and Biden ride or die people have been really getting on this tip lately of, like you're not helping anybody by doing these protests. And I want to make it clear that while, again, we look back on things like the Black Panther movement, on things like civil rights protests and sit-ins, now we look back on those and know that they were good things. At the time, broadly, they were not seen that way. Which is a little something to think about. Gallup poll 1961. Do you think sit-ins at lunch counters, freedom buses, and other demonstrations by Negroes will hurt or help Negroes' chances of being integrated into the South? More than half said hurt. Do you think mass demonstrations are more likely to help or more likely hurt? June 1963, May 1964. 1964, it went down to 16% from 27% the previous year. Let us talk about, since we're still in the 60s, some Vietnam protests. In many ways, the student protests at the University of Wisconsin mirrored those taking place on campuses across the country. The first substantial demonstration in October 1963 occurred when there were only military advisors in Vietnam, and it opposed the government's support for Ngo Dinh Diem, the repressive president of South Vietnam. We have protests for the draft. A lot of these, obviously, based on colleges. Would you believe that people have been saying the same shit about kids protesting for all of time? That they're inexperienced yuppies who've never had to worry about anything in their life? Again, some things kind of don't really change in America. Protest and police response marked the first time that a campus anti-war demonstration had turned violent. It would not be the last time. Rough confrontations became much more common in the years that followed, culminating most horribly in the May 1970 shooting of 13 Kent State University students by National Guardsmen. 4 of those Kent State students died. That event, combined with Nixon's invasion of Cambodia, led to protests at more than 1,300 college campuses, with some 500 closed by student and faculty strikes. ROTC facilities were attacked and police and National Guard troops were dispatched to more than 100 colleges. In August of that year, the anti-war protests at the University of Wisconsin took an ominous turn. A bomb destroyed the building holding the Army Math Research Center, killing 1 young scientist. Now, let's go back to civil rights real quick. For Selma and Bloody Sunday. The passage of, in 1964, the landmark Civil Rights Act months earlier had done little in some parts of the state to ensure African Americans of the basic right to vote. Perhaps no place was Jim Crow's grip tighter than in Dallas County, Alabama, where African Americans made up more than half of the population, yet accounted for just 2% of registered voters. For months, the efforts of Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to register black voters had been thwarted. In January 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. came to the city and gave the backing of the Southern Christian Leadership Council to the cause. Peaceful demonstrations in Selma and surrounding communities resulted in arrests of thousands, including King, who wrote into the New York Times, "This is Selma, Alabama. There are more Negroes in jail with me than there are on voting rolls." The rising racial tensions finally bubbled over into bloodshed in the nearby town of Marion, where state troopers clubbed protesters and fatally shot 26-year-old Jimmy Lee Jackson, an African-American demonstrator trying to protect his mother, who was being struck by police. The demonstrators, naturally, marched undisturbed through downtown Selma, where the ghosts of the past constantly permeated the present. They began to cross the steel-arched bridge spanning the Alabama River. The marchers who gazed up could see the name of a Confederate general and reputed Grand Dragon of the Alabama Ku Klux Klan, Edmund Pettus, staring right back at them in big block letters emblazoned on the bridge's crossbeam. Once Lewis and Williams reached the crest of the bridge, they saw trouble on the other side. A wall of state troopers wearing white helmets and slapping billy clubs in their hands stretched across Route 80 at the base of the span. Beneath them were deputies of County Sheriff Jim Clark, some on horseback and dozens of white spectators waving Confederate flags and giddily anticipating a showdown. Knowing a confrontation awaited, the marchers pressed on in a thin column down the bridge's sidewalk until they stopped about 50 feet from the authority. After a few moments, the troopers with gas masks affixed to their faces and clubs at the ready advanced. They pushed back. Again, this is a peaceful protest. So many of these have been peaceful protests until the police escalate. They knocked marchers to the ground. They struck them with sticks. Clouds of tear gas mixed with the screams of terrified marchers and the cheers of reveling bystanders. Deputies on horseback charged ahead and chased the gasping men, women, and children back over the bridges. They swung clubs, whips, and rubber tubing wrapped in barbed wire. Although forced back, the protesters did not fight back. This time, television cameras captured the entire assault and transformed the local protest into a national civil rights event. It took hours for the film to be flown from Alabama to the television network headquarters in New York, but when it aired that night, Americans were appalled at the sights and sounds of Bloody Sunday. Outrage at Bloody Sunday swept the country. Sympathizers staged sit-ins, traffic blockades, and demonstrations in solidarity with the voting rights marchers. Some even traveled to Selma, where 2 days later, King attempted another march, but to the dismay of some demonstrators, turned back when troopers again blocked the highway at Edmund Pettus Bridge. Finally, a federal court order permitted the protest. The voting rights marchers left Selma on March 21st, under the protection of federalized National Guard troops. 4 days later, they reached Montgomery, with the crowd growing to 25,000 by the time they reached the capital steps. The events in Selma galvanized public opinion and mobilized Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act, which President Johnson signed into law on August 6, 1965. Between that, the labor rights movement, and the suffragette movement, sure does seem like not only are these people on the right side of history when they are so firmly opposed by the government, but that we owe so much of the things we take for granted to this method of civil disobedience. I want to go to 1966, where one more big protest before Stonewall. Donna Persona does not want to be tolerated. I am to be loved, adored, and respected, the 72-year-old San Francisco woman declared on a recent morning, seated inside her fifth-story apartment. Persona is preparing to serve as Grand Marshal at the city's Pride Festival this year and has no patience for anyone's tolerance. Quote, "Fuck that shit, give me my rights." Her Pride mantra, "It ain't a party, it's time to act up," honored the transgender women who, more than 50 years ago, showed her how to live and fight back. In 1966, 3 years before the world-famous Stonewall riot in New York, a group of trans women in San Francisco stood up to police inside Gene Compton's cafeteria, an all-night restaurant in the Tenderloin neighborhood and popular queer gathering spot. A trans woman fed up with the harassment and abuse is said to have thrown a cup of coffee in an officer's face, sparking a chaotic riot and an unprecedented moment of trans resistance to police violence. Quote, "These ladies took the bullets for us," said Persona, a performer and activist who went to Compton's cafeteria as a teenager in the 60s and now lives down the streets. "Everybody in our community stands on their shoulders." And that does not just apply to this protest for this movement, because one thing that I hope you gather from looking at all of these things in totality is how close in proximity all of these movements are with one another. When you look at, I shared it on Twitter earlier, there was a post, and of course it was a conservative doing the fascist thing of saying, oh, look how ugly all of the pro-Palestinian supporters are. And on one side, they had their good guys, who are just all white, upper middle class looking, straight white boys. And on the other side were the Palestinian protesters of every skin color, of every gender, some Muslim, some Christian, men, women, people of every identity. I'm assuming, very likely, people of every gender and sexual orientation. And that, to me, is such a great illustration of how tied together these movements are, intrinsically, at their core. These struggles, as we'll read again, I'm going to finish up with the letter from Birmingham jail, they affect everybody. And so when somebody says, like, we stand on their shoulders, it's important to remember that it's not just, if you're a queer person or a black person, you're standing on the shoulders of what people in your community did for you. You stand on the shoulders of what other people fought and suffered and bled for. That led to those people fighting and standing up and bleeding. In many ways, black liberation movements, queer liberation movements, feminist movements, suffragette movements, they're not that different, ultimately, from the violence, from the threats, the harassment, the blood spilled by people in the labor movements, by abolitionists. And that is an integral part of American identity that so few people seem to know about or understand. Like this is where solidarity between movements and intersectionality is so important. Because we have this shared history, this shared trauma between all of these minority groups. That obviously is not the same. Like I'm not saying that, my experience as a queer person has ever been similar to somebody's experience as a Black person or a Latino person. Like, we've all had different struggles specifically. But broadly, the structures of power have continued to try and keep us down in the same ways, which is why you see such diversity in pro-Palestinian protests, I feel, from people who are able to recognize that. Even if not explicitly, they understand it as a subtext. No one knows the exact date of Compton's cafeteria riot. In fact, if it wasn't for Dr. Susan Stryker, the event might have been almost entirely forgotten. I actually have Susan Stryker's book. Transgender History by Susan Stryker is a phenomenal book that I'll probably be referencing for my upcoming queer history stream on Stonewall. And if you haven't read it and you have any interest in like movements like this, Transgender History, Dr. Susan Stryker, phenomenal book. The trans historian was rifling through the Gay and Lesbian Historical Society archives in 1991 when she stumbled upon a timeline of historic events that referenced an August 1966 event, drag queens protest police harassment at Compton's cafeteria. It took Stryker years to figure out what happened. A city archivist told her there were no arrest reports, that the records have been disappeared. So she slowly built her own paper trail and learned how the corner of Turk and Taylor Streets, where Compton's was located, was trans central. Eventually, she met Amanda St. James, a trans woman who had lived in a hotel in the area and was present at the riot. Mind you, this was in the 50s and 60s. So this is the kind of thing you should know about and be able to talk about off the top of your head the next time some dipshit TERF or gender critical comes at you with like, oh, trans people weren't a thing before like 2016. Like, you need to be able to show them this and tell them to sit and spin on it. Persona remembers things differently. When she was around 17, she hopped on the Greyhound bus from San Jose to San Francisco and eventually wound up being a regular at Compton's cafeteria. Quote, "They were the most beautiful women I'd ever seen," said Persona, who is raised in a large Mexican family with a Baptist minister father. "It was like I'm home. In a way, I really felt like I was in Wonderland. They took care of me like big sisters. They were just so sweet to me and to each other." Trans women talked in the documentary about their struggles as sex workers in the neighborhood and the ways they found brief refuge at Compton's. The women often faced intense violence from clients and police and would check up on each other and hang at the restaurant. The mainstream erasure of Compton's from discussions of LGBT resistance is partly due to the exclusion of trans people from the gay rights movement and pride parades in the years that followed. LeGrand says she still encounters gay men in San Francisco who have never heard of it. For the average LGBT person, Stonewall is the beginning of the actual movement to them. But for trans girls, it's Compton's cafeteria. A group of younger trans women are now working hard to make sure people don't forget 1966. It's a life and death thing for many members of the trans community. Mahogany, who previously worked as a social worker, has seen firsthand in recent years how trans people in the neighborhood struggle to access resources and housing and are sometimes pushed out of San Francisco with little support. I won't talk too much about this because I will be doing an upcoming stream on it. I'm hoping next week, but we'll see if I can get it all planned out. The 1960s and preceding decades were not welcome time for lesbian, gay, bi, and trans Americans. For instance, solicitation of same-sex relations was illegal in New York. For such reasons, LGBT individuals flocked to gay bars and clubs, places of refuge where they could express themselves openly and socialize without worry. However, the New York State Liquor Authority penalized and shut down establishments that served alcohol to known or suspected LGBT individuals, arguing that the mere gathering of homosexuals was disorderly. The first documented gay rights organization, the Society for Human Rights, was founded in 1924. Police raids forced them to disband in 1925, but not before they had published several issues of the newsletter Friendship and Freedom. In 1966, 3 years before Stonewall, members of the Mattachine Society, an organization dedicated to gay rights, staged a sip-in where they openly declared their sexuality at taverns, daring staff to turn them away and suing establishments who did. When the Commission to Human Rights ruled that gay individuals had the right to be served in bars, police raids were temporarily reduced. The crime syndicate saw profit and catering to shunned gay clientele, and by the mid-1960s, the Genovese crime family controlled most Greenwich Village gay bars. In 1966, they purchased Stonewall Inn, cheaply renovated it, and reopened it the next year as a gay bar, which is one of the most based and brilliant things like the mafia has ever done, is to basically buy a gay bar. Like, hey, we got a gay bar here for all the gays in town. Hey, come on, no way. I just like picturing like homophobic Italians justifying, and this isn't an Italian thing, I'm just thinking in broad terms of like mafia families justifying opening up gay bars because they just know it's going to bring in money. Yeah, no, exactly. It's just Quiet Kitsune, gay money spends just as well. It's like, I don't care who dick you suck as long as you're paying me. Hey, oh, wow. Oh. Hey, I'm being myself over here. Hey, come on. Sorry. Staying in the closet, forget about it. Without police interference, the crime family could cut costs how they saw fit. The club lacked a fire exit, running water behind the bar to wash glasses, clean toilets that didn't routinely overflow, and palatable drinks that weren't watered down beyond recognition. What's more, the mafia reportedly blackmailed the club's wealthier patrons who wanted to keep their sexuality a secret. Nonetheless, Stonewall Inn quickly became an important Greenwich Village institution. It was large and relatively cheap to enter. It welcomed drag queens who received a bitter reception at other gay bars and clubs. It was a nightly home for many runaways and homeless gay youths who panhandled and shoplifted to afford the entry fee. It was one of the few, if not the only, gay bar left that allowed dancing. Raids were still a fact of life, but usually corrupt cops would tip off mafia-run bars before they occurred, allowing owners to stash the alcohol and hide other illegal activities. In fact, the NYPD has stormed Stonewall Inn just a few days before the riot-inducing raid. Fed up with constant police harassment and social discrimination, angry patrons and neighborhood residents hung around the bar rather than dispersed, becoming increasingly agitated as events unfolded, and people were aggressively manhandled. At one point, an officer hit a lesbian over the head as he forced her into the police van. She shouted to onlookers to act, inciting the crowd to begin throw pennies, bottles, cobblestones, and other objects at the police. Within minutes, a full-blown riot involving hundreds of people began. The police, a few prisoners, and a village voice writer barricaded themselves in the bar, which the mob attempted to set on fire after breaching the barricade repeatedly. The fire department and riot squad were eventually able to douse the flames, rescue those inside of Stonewall, and disperse the crowd, but the protests, sometimes involving thousands of people, continued in the area for 5 more days, flaring up at one point after the Village Voice published its accounts of the riots. Because not something that actually got protested so much as just showing the reckless disregard police have for the lives of civilians and how they will employ violence. Structures will just employ violence wantonly against the civilian populace they're supposed to be protecting. In the evening of May 13, 1985, long-standing tensions between MOVE, a black liberation group, and the Philadelphia Police Department erupted horrifically. That night, the city of Philadelphia dropped a satchel bomb, a demolition device typically used in combat, laced with Tovex and C4 explosives, on the MOVE organization, who were living in a West Philadelphia row home known to be occupied by men, women, and children. It went up in unextinguished flames. 11 people were killed, including 5 children and the founder of the organization. 61 homes were destroyed, and more than 250 citizens were left homeless. For the next several years, the confrontation with MOVE would be remembered as an ordeal that transformed the fabric of the city. The show of force, unjustified to many. Who the hell would say that's justified? Solidified mistrust between Philadelphia's residents and government, as if it hadn't been solidified before that. The story is a parable of sorts. It's a parable of how the unthinkable comes to happen. It's a tragedy, in my opinion. Everyone who was an adult in that city failed that day. Collectively, the whole city failed. The police in America, when you see footage of protesters being beaten over the head and bleeding profusely, and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that police in America are like, this is acting like a fascist regime. They did this in the 80s. The 80s. And going to be a little bit just talking more about how police beat the shit out of people. Like this is a unfortunately very common occurrence in our day and age, where we've dealt with BLM of all kinds, like Tamir Rice, George Floyd, of course. Like I would even say Trayvon Martin. 25 years ago this week, 4 Los Angeles policemen, 3 of them white, were acquitted of the savage beating of Rodney King, an African-American man. Caught on camera by a bystander, graphic video of the attack was broadcast into homes across the nation and worldwide. Fury over the acquittal, stoked by years of racial and economic inequality in the city, spilled over into the streets, resulting in 5 days of rioting in Los Angeles. You notice how the black districts, like we were talking about Black Wall Street, that had actually built up economic wealth and was destroyed. But you notice how everywhere else, it sure seems like the police are the ones keeping so many of these poor neighborhoods poor. When police finally stopped him, King was ordered out of the car. Los Angeles Police Department officers then kicked him repeatedly and beat him with batons for a reported 15 minutes. The video shows More than a dozen cops stood by watching and commenting on the beating. This is what cops are like, by the way. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, obviously, it matters that he's black in the grand scheme of, like, the discourse. But it doesn't matter if it's a college student, if it's a child. Like, they will engage with this level of violence more often than not. I watched when there was the BLM protests in my town. The protesters, so the George Floyd protests in Spokane, the protesters broke into a Nike store. And some people were starting to loot. And it was the protesters, not the police. The police sat back on their asses, did nothing. It was the protesters who got everybody out of the Nike store. And then about a half hour later, by my recollection, it was a little bit of time. A half hour later, the police decided that it was time to use their fancy equipment. And they started launching tear gas canisters and rubber bullets. And I saw one indigenous girl who's a member of the local indigenous community being arrested, and the police were holding her face down into a canister of tear gas that had been activated. Like right in her face. And I don't know if any of you, I've had tear gas in my face. I don't know if any of you have had tear gas in your face. It's unfucking pleasant when it's far away. And we had pictures of them laughing. Like a cop standing over her, laughing as the others were arresting her and taking their time, rubbing her face in a tear gas canister. A tear gas is one of those things where it's like everybody thinks they understand tear gas until it actually comes out. Like, you saw a lot of people. The thing is that you need practice to manage tear gas. So like when you saw a lot of the protesters who were in like LA or Seattle, and they would take traffic cones and like dilute and disarm like tear gas canisters and stuff, those people that had practice, it's not as easy when it's happening to you for the first time and you have to look through everything and you're unprepared. And you like every orifice in your face just starts leaking and everything burns at the same time. Like it's one of those things where like, yeah, everybody's a badass until the tear gas comes out. Police in riot gear entered the San Francisco State campus in a show of force during student demonstrations that were meant to shut the college down during a strike November 4th, 1968. This is exactly, mind you again, when dumbasses like Destiny talk about like, oh, well, these people get what they deserve. I need you to understand, by his rhetoric, he would have been against civil rights protests. He would have been against the measures that led to the Civil Rights Act. Vietnam War protests. We talked about Kent State University. College students demanded the war's end and spoke out against the military draft that put them at risk of being sent to fight after graduation. President Richard Nixon, who was elected in 1968, partly due to his promise to end the war, announced in the spring of 1970 that U.S. troops had entered Cambodia. The incursion triggered large-scale protests among the anti-war movement. 1960, a student throws a tear gas canister back at guardsmen during clashes. 1970. After several standoffs, the troops headed back up the hill in the direction of the ROTC building. As they reached the top, they turned towards the demonstrators and opened fire. This, if it wasn't in black and white, this could be a photo of anything today. I didn't talk about it much, but apartheid South Africa is another one where actually very similarly, because Israel is basically an apartheid state, but very similarly to the protests here, just something that like people really forgot in America, in the American consciousness about apartheid South Africa. Between the 1960s and 1980s, U.S. student activists led a nationwide movement to pressure their universities to cut financial ties with companies that supported South Africa's apartheid regime, which is exactly what students are doing right now. They want their colleges to cut ties with people like Gonzaga here in town wants to, their students want the university to cut ties with Boeing, who is a major manufacturer through its subsidiaries and stuff, supplying weapons and shit to Israel right now. Here again, the U.S. anti-apartheid movement gained momentum through student-led protests on campuses where students demanded their universities divest from all South Africa-related investments. Students successfully pressured multiple universities nationwide, including in New York, California, and North Carolina, to sever financial ties. Students marched in solidarity with renowned anti-apartheid activist Nelson Mandela, who had been sentenced to life in prison in 1964. Mandela would ultimately spend 27 years in prison for opposing the apartheid system in South Africa. Again, almost seems like these kids are kind of onto something, doesn't it? Like they kind of get proven right by history, despite all of these systems trying to besmirch them, beat them down, get them to give up. And we owe so much to the people who do not give up. Here's another sit-in. Some of the 400 students occupied the old student union at Stanford University in San Jose in 1977 to protest the school's investment holdings in companies that do business with apartheid South Africa. Later, scores of students were arrested. Another picture. You changed the hairdos, you changed some of the clothes. This could be today. We have, of course, the BLM movement. More than 400 medical students, faculty, and medical professionals at the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine knelt for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, the length of time that police held Floyd down in silent protest of his death. In 2015, Columbia University became the first college in the U.S. to divest from private prison companies after the student protest demanded it. How the fuck? Like, glad that happened, but how the fuck is that? How is that a thing that we need to do? But I wanted to read, if you haven't read this and you have any agreement, any want to do any kind of protesting, Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail is an essential read. But he lays out so succinctly the need for intersectionality, the understanding of the need for disruptive protest. And I think after going through everything we've just read, from the labor movement to the suffragettes, civil rights actors, gay liberation actors, anti-war protesters, it's important to remember how far we've come because of everybody who fought and died in those protests. And despite the government not wanting to take accountability, and how it will protect its own interests. Time and time again. Fred Hampton, Abu Ghraib, South America. That doesn't mean that we give up the fight for equality, the fight for recognition, the fight to help others. First page. Moreover, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow, provincial, outside agitator ideas. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an agitator. I would say, in addition to that, you cannot separate what is happening over in Palestine to what happens here. As much as people want to say, oh, well, you know, we should be just focus on our sovereignty and our borders. Like, first off, the United States government doesn't want to do that. We could house and feed and get every homeless person and every drug addict all they need to be fully emancipated, quote unquote, productive members of society. We simply choose not to. Like that's the long and short of it. We simply choose not to. Like the US government has no incentive to actually help its people over here. Like you don't get that from nationalists, quote unquote nationalists a lot. That being said, we're at a point in history where you cannot simply turn away from what's happening overseas, because it is constantly happening in our pocket, on our phone, on our computer, at all times of the day. Our entire political structure is informed by how politicians will react to these issues and whether they become tangents in an ongoing culture war. It is all connected now more than ever. So we can't just afford, quite literally, to turn our backs and be like, oh, well, it's happening over in the Middle East, so it's not my problem. That's not the way it works. That's not the way the world works anymore. You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You're exactly right in your call for negotiation. Indeed, this is the purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and establish such creative tension that a community that has consistently refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. I just referred to the creation of tension as part of the work of the nonviolent resistor. This may sound rather shocking, but I must confess I am not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly worked and preached against violent tension, but there is a type of constructive nonviolent tension that is necessary for growth. Socrates felt that it was necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal. We must see the need of having nonviolent gadflies to create the kind of tension in a society that will help men to rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. So the purpose of direct action is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. We therefore concur with you in your call for negotiation. Too long has our beloved Southland been bogged down in the tragic attempt to live in monologue rather than dialogue. I feel like that pretty well gets at the need for disruptive protest. Think back to these world-changing protests we've been talking about. Automakers unions sitting in. Steel workers fighting for their rights. Suffragettes disrupting. Continuing to work at their causes not when it was convenient for those in power, but when it became inconvenient. You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. This is certainly a legitimate concern since we so diligently urge people to obey the Supreme Court's decision of 1954 outlawing segregation in the public schools. It is rather strange and paradoxical to find us consciously breaking laws. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer is found in the fact that there are two types of laws. There are just laws and there are unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. I can never forget that everything Hitler did in Germany was legal, and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany. But I am sure that if I had lived in Germany during that time, I would have aided and comforted my Jewish brothers, even though it was illegal. If I had lived in a communist country today where certain principles dear to the Christian faith are suppressed, I believe I would openly advocate disobeying these anti-religion laws. Here we go. This one is a little bit longer, but like this, again, I cannot express enough. You need to go read this entire thing because the entire letter from Birmingham jail is like, he's spitting. Like it's impeccable. It holds the test of time for nearly any protest you can think about. You spoke of our activity in Birmingham as extreme. At first, I was rather disappointed that fellow clergymen would see my nonviolent efforts as those of an extremist. I started thinking about the fact that I stand in the middle of two opposing forces in the Negro community. One is a force of complacency, made up of Negroes who, as a result of long years of oppression, have been so completely drained of self-respect and a sense of somebodyness, they've adjusted to segregation, and on the other hand, of a few Negroes in the middle class who, because of a degree of academic and economic security, and because at points they profit by segregation, have unconsciously become insensitive to the problems of the masses. This is talking about class traders. This is talking about people who have vested interests in not protesting. Even though people like them might be subjugated, they have interest in not joining them. You're seeing this a lot right now on the left with liberals and centrists. Oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. The urge for freedom will eventually come. This is what has happened to the American Negro. Something within has reminded him of his birthright of freedom. Something without has reminded him that he can gain it. Consciously and unconsciously, he has been swept in by what the Germans call the zeitgeist. And with his black brothers of Africa and his brown and yellow brothers of Asia, South America, and the Caribbean, he's moving with a sense of cosmic urgency towards the promised land of racial justice. Remember when I was talking about earlier? When it comes to... Remember what I was talking about earlier when it comes to intersectionality and these movements all working in concert with one another. That's exactly what he's getting at here. This is a good one. This one's especially prescient today. Especially prescient over the last couple days. I had hoped that the white moderate would see this. Maybe I was too optimistic. Maybe I expected too much. I guess I should have realized that few members of a race that is oppressed another race can understand or appreciate the deep groans and passionate yearnings of those who have been oppressed. The white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. And those are still the people on the left, on the right, everywhere, speaking out against necessary protesting. On one hand, I think it's hard to look at all of these things, all of these people who have been killed and tortured for standing up for the rights that we enjoy, at a time when those rights are still under attack. We are looking down the barrel of possibly another Trump presidency. Who knows at this point? And I think it's hard to look back at the history of America and the history of protest in America and know that this shit has always been this way. When we see the police in riot gear marching to assault and shoot college kids in the face, it's always been that way. When we see them acting in the interests of corporations, protecting private property, without a care to the fact that our tax dollars are going actively to helping abet a genocide. But I think there is also a lot of hope, which is what I wanted to go through all of this for. In looking back at 150 years of civil disobedience, of protesting, both violent and nonviolent, of sit-ins and trespassing, and bravely standing up for rights that everybody else was too moderate to care about. The people whose names are now forgotten created the world we know today. It's the suffragettes who fought and bled and were tortured that got women the right to vote. Not the men who signed the law, the women who inconvenienced them, who protested and didn't give up. It should not go to, the credit should not go to the business owners and the billionaires, people like Henry Ford and Carnegie, whose names we still know, but to the countless nameless strikers and workers who fought and died and starved and waited for better working conditions. The things we enjoy today. American history is full of these unacknowledged heroes. And that is truly what I think you have to call people like this, who are purely self-sacrificing. And time and again, no matter what the media or the police or politicians want to throw at these people, they are proven vindicated by history and their actions for standing up for each other and for themselves when nobody else will. And I think every aspect of everything we've talked about today is important to remember as we continue to watch the protests for Palestine unfold. And important to keep in mind going into an election season that will surely have even more protests.